Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you back for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds with my good friend and colleague, Matt Kelly. In this podcast, we take a deep dive into some particular issue relating to compliance. And this week, we're going to look at budgeting in the compliance process. This is something that has been on the minds of compliance practitioners since the announcement of the FCPA pilot program back in early April, because one of the indicia under the remediation component listed out included the resources available to the compliance practitioner, the compliance function within a corporation, and of course the chief compliance officer. That means dollars. So how do you determine what's the right amount of dollars for your compliance program? I also pitched to Matt the question of, can there be a verification or validation for compliance internal controls similar to what's used in SOX 404 reporting? As always, it's a deep dive. If you want to geek out into compliance, this is the podcast for you. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Ambassador for the Red Flag Group. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox with another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds with my good friend and colleague, Matt Kelly. Matt, welcome.
Hello, Tom. Always good to be talking with you.
So, Matt, you had a very interesting, timely, and I would have to say very unique blog post up this week entitled Finding the Right Compliance Budget. And I say all of those things because although that's a great topic for discussion with any compliance officer or compliance practitioner, particularly in the middle of corporate budget season, I can't think of anybody else who's written about it. So I thought we could just geek out on this one and tell us what you were thinking, what you put into it, and what information led you to your conclusions.
Sure, yeah. And so, in fact, anybody who is interested in what Tom and I are talking about, I should say I posted this comment on my blog. It's at radicalcompliance.com for a friend and fellow compliance officer, for any of you who are listening out there. He emailed me, and he is a compliance executive in the Middle East, trying to build a program at his business out there, and basically said, how does one get even a rough estimate of how big a compliance department should be in terms of dollars against your own business and activity? And he was asking, is this a percent of annual revenue, percent of your operating margin, percent of employees, or, payroll or sales, or what? And so I was really intrigued by that concept. And I posted my thoughts there about a budget. And of course, if anybody listening has their own thoughts about it, I'm sure we'd love to hear about them. But basically, I was surprised, number one, at how little information there is about the size of a compliance budget, like what surveys are out there. A lot of surveys don't ask specifically about budgets or staff size, or they do so in the most rudimentary ways. They focus more on how much do you worry about third-party risks, who your boss is, your reporting structure, that kind of stuff. But, real budgets. And also, I was trying to get a sense of your budget relative to your own company's activity, not necessarily what your company's budget is relative to its peers or whatnot or anything like that. And so, we can get into the weeds if we want, but I came up with a couple of different thoughts for my friend here, and that's where the post came from.
Well, I would definitely like to get into the weeds, and let me just pick up on a couple of things. The first one was at the FCPA Blog New York conference. Lanny Brewer spoke, and most of the press about his speech was around his comments on the pilot program, but he also had some very interesting comments about what the department now expects in the form of your compliance program. And he talked a lot about right-sized for your company and right spend for your company. So I think you're tapping into something that a little more sophistication the department has, and Brewer credited that sophistication to Wei Chin. And the only time I have ever heard anyone speak at the various conferences I go to about their compliance budget, a woman in the medical supply space told me, or I guess it was health service, that she was under a corporate integrity agreement, and they were told by the Department of Justice to have 1% of their annual revenues dedicated to compliance. And this was a multi-billion-dollar company, and even she thought that was unrealistic. So any guidance you can give in terms of the numbers or what the budget might depend on, I think would be of incredible use at this point going forward.
Sure. So I did some digging around, and I'll start with the numbers and survey data I did find, and I did take a look around. One good place to look would be Deloitte's Compliance Trends Report, specifically for 2015. I do not know that they have a 2016 version out. I haven't seen one. But in the 2015 version, they found that I was involved with Deloitte with that survey. We surveyed about 360 different compliance people across many industries. 43% of them had a total budget, staff salaries, tech equipment, travel budget, and all that stuff, total budget of $1 million or less. That was 43% of everybody we surveyed. And 48% had 5 people or fewer working full-time in the compliance function. So that's generally a good sign, and I've heard it anecdotally, a good sign that even at large companies, most compliance departments are pretty small. Right. To your friend there, if you're at a $5 or $10 billion company and you spend 1% of $10 billion, say, on a compliance budget, I mean, that's a lot of money. So I don't necessarily know that would work.
Right.
The Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics also has a very good one, that it does look at budgets and it stratifies it out by company size in terms of revenue and in terms of total employees. And you can then see what are the budgets and averages for companies of that certain size in revenue or in employees. But what it does not do is really get into the weeds of what does the average budget look like by industry. I think first that is very important for people. I came out with 3 factors that I think are important for how big your budget should be. It does depend on your industry. If you're in a highly regulated industry like financial services, pharmaceuticals, they can have battalions of people working on compliance in one form or another. I know some people listening will say, yes, Matt, but those battalions are more industry specific. They're not corporate compliance and ethics. That is a valid point to raise. I think some companies still will find that the line between what's industry compliance, like employee surveillance on insider trading at a financial services firm or quality control at pharmaceuticals, what's the line between that and good policy and process that traditional compliance and ethics officers would worry about? That can get a little bit blurry, but still, you really should be looking first at what are my industry peers saying, just to give you a rough sense. Second, I think you should look at your supply chain. A person I met at a conference I was attending earlier this week, they were talking about the more your company outsources, the more third parties it has, which then leads to the more third-party risks you may or may not have. And if you outsource office supplies, that does not mean that WB Mason or Staples is going to be a high-risk client of yours, but nonetheless, you have to think through, if we outsource a lot in corporate functions, corporate activity, sales agreements, legal help, IT protection, or whatnot, you're going to have more third-party risks you need to think about. That means more budget, possibly, more policies, but that's a big indicator of how much activity and work you might need, is the amount of supply chain outsourcing that you have and the structure of your supply chain. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, this really does depend on your leadership. Like I said before, the data do show that even very large companies can have very small compliance departments, but that's not necessarily a bad thing if your leaders are very dedicated to compliance and they have a very empowered chief compliance officer. Then the CCO is able to get a lot done by other means, such as a good HR department, good contract management in the legal department, good supply chain management in the procurement department, and they can do a lot of this work If it's embedded in their processes, then maybe you can get away with a $600,000 budget to cover you and an assistant and an administrative person. That might not be wrong. So those are some of the internal factors that you'd need to look at just to get a sense of how big should my budget be relative to my company's activities. Industry, supply chain, and leadership.
So on the leadership, and that really, that part in your blog post really wanted to explore a little bit more in depth, because one of the things that certainly I've advocated, and I think you've talked about at some length, is how do you move compliance down to the operational level? And with the pressure from the Department of Justice talking about that issue, wanting to see compliance more operationalized within the business unit or another functional unit other than compliance, how does a company demonstrate, one, operationalness of their compliance program, that two, the second question that the DOJ is going to ask is, how much did you spend? And how does a company not so much consolidate, but justify, if we're not spending a lot in the compliance department, do we have the operational nature of our compliance program plugged in, and can we demonstrate that? And if we can maybe even take it a step further, what internal controls do we have in place in each one of those functional units to bring all of that information forward should a regulator ever come knocking?
I think it's a good question, because I as much as I do like regulators, and I do, especially any of them who are listening to this podcast, they really do need to bring a open mind and sophisticated appreciation of how companies could try to get to the goal, even if their paths to it might be a little bit non-obvious. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean, and it is one I included in my post here. I know one investment services firm, I think it was a hedge fund out in Chicago, that wanted to hire its first ever chief compliance officer. It had no very strong compliance department until then, but the hedge fund made a decision. We want a superstar, that was their word to the recruiter who told me this story. We want a superstar compliance officer who knows the law cold for our industry, but knows how to work with other business units and basically cooperate with the business units to really restructure and embed compliance into their business processes. We do not want a chief compliance officer who's going to monitor all transactions and do all surveillance, him or herself, and hire a battalion of compliance analysts. That's not what we want. We want someone who knows how to bake the compliance into the business process. They want a good baker. And so they found this superstar. I asked the recruiter how much money this person made, and the recruiter told me a boatload. That is the direct quote. But paying for one yacht is still going to be cheaper than paying for a fleet of smaller ships. And I see the sense in that. There's good logic there. How might you actually then demonstrate that you've operationalized compliance? I think that they'd want to see a lot of your policies, a lot of your procedures, not necessarily your code of conduct. I'm sure it's going to be great. So was Enron's, looked awesome, but you need to get more granular. Not only is this our code, Mr. Regulator, but here's our policies putting it into place. Here are the controls that we can show are being met by this policy, and really get a bit granular like that. I think, and maybe even here's an audit from an outside audit agency or a firm, or our internal audit function. They did an audit of our compliance. Here's their effectiveness report. You can see all of this. And that's why we have only one compliance officer, and we pay them relatively a lot, but it's still not a huge compliance department in budget or manpower. It's good in terms of results. I think a lot of companies would like to get there. I remain unclear on how many compliance regulators would actually see it that way. Although, to your point, Tom, I agree that having people like Hui Chen over at the fraud division at the Justice Department, that's good, because she comes and she does have that appreciation for this is how the world can work, and it can spin in multiple ways.
So, Matt, you wrote a blog post for Workiva, who we both consult with, which was entitled SOX Certification Programs That Work Well. And you had a couple of good practices around SOX certification. The first one was ditch the attachments, and the second one was remember who answers to whom within your internal controls regime. Are those points broad enough that you think they could apply to compliance internal controls as well? Because that certainly struck me when I read your blog post for Workiva.
I think so, yeah. A lot of what the Workiva people were bringing up in that session are just good practices anyways, regardless of who your compliance technology vendor might be. Clearly, Workiva has an idea of who they would like you to work with, but even them aside, you really want to think through things like if you have attachments that you are sending around to have people certify the effectiveness of control. The control may change by the time you get a certification back. The control may, some of these certifications might be somewhat sensitive and they might slip outside the company's network. You lose version control. Somebody might modify the certification that you send them. They change the Word document. They send it back. They forget to track the change. And suddenly you've got different people certifying different things. If you have a certification process where you remove the ability for people to alter that which you want them to certify, then you really their only choice is, yes, I certify this works, or no, I don't. But something like a web page, you can't change a web page. You just have to do what the web page allows you to do. And then also your second point about thinking through who reports to whom about internal controls. A lot of controls might be divided among two people, or one person might do half of a control before the supervisor confirms it. You don't want the supervisor to confirm something before the subordinate says, well, actually, step one doesn't work all that well. So therefore, step two, the boss doesn't work well either. If you miss that because the boss has already said step two works great, and then 5 weeks later you find out actually step one is down the toilet and therefore all of our step twos are wrong, you need to be thinking through who can certify what in what order. Do you want to nest certifications within each other, that they have to start with this person before they can go to that person and then the next two and so forth and so on? I know that there are some companies with controls that could be certified by multiple people. Is it either or can certify or all must certify? Is it person one and then two and then three? Can it be one and then three and then two when they get back from vacation? That kind of stuff. So there are some best principles there that I do think work well no matter what, whether it's a SOX control or some other anti-corruption control or IT security or whatnot. Good control practices are sort of agnostic about what they're actually controlling.
And what also intrigued me is I had breakfast with a chief compliance officer from a major energy company in Houston today, and he told me that one of the initiatives that their company has put into place is having regional managers, regional vice presidents reporting up to the EVPs for the regions outside the United States actually certify a series of compliance adjuncts to their compliance program, such as training, such as management of payment to third parties, such as code of conduct. And one of the reasons they were doing it was to put accountability down the line as opposed to simply at the top. But also the light bulb went off on my head. Well, why couldn't you use something similar to that around compliance internal controls? So when I sort of read your Workiva piece, it began to get me to thinking maybe we could tie all of this together if the concepts are similar enough, recognizing that the individual certifications would need to reflect whether it's accounting controls, financial controls, or compliance controls. So it just seemed to me that the concepts you were putting forward were broad enough that we could at least use those as a basis for discussion in compliance.
I think so, yeah. And in the SOX compliance world in particular, I can remember the first time I wrote a story about SOX certifications and sub-certifications and then sub-sub and so forth and kind of pushing it all down the line. I mean, I think I first wrote about that in 2004. It is not a new idea in the SOX compliance world to do this. It is a process that if you're doing it manually can be rife with errors or loss of, no pun intended, but loss of control over the process as people certify different things at different times and it's incorrect. So, at Workiva, they were really talking about how you get a good grip on this idea overall. But you're right that, it just so happens we were a bunch of SOX people talking about this. It could be any number of risks that have controls around them. Just confirming that the controls work, that those best practices apply regardless of what the risk actually is here.
And I'd like to transition over to a conference that you just attended. But before I do, I really would like to pick up on one point you started with in your discussion about the blog post today, which was that this started through a conversation with a colleague. And a question was put to you, and you put it out to your greater radical compliance community. And then you took some of that information, did additional research, and came up with a blog post. And that's one of the things that I found is not only for me very personally satisfying, but also I think it helps the greater community when people like you and I can kind of throw those questions out there. We can say, do you have a question that you'd like somebody to take a deeper dive in? Throw that question back to the community, get input, add our own research, and then kind of put it all together in a way that a lot of people can use that information. So kudos to you for doing that.
No, I'm always happy to work for the compliance community like this. So anybody else out there, if you ever have an idea you want us to shoot the breeze about, just let us know.
So with that, you were over in Europe, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the conference you attended and how you found it, having seen several conferences here in the U.S. over your career.
Sure. So I was in Rome, which was lovely. And that was for Skytop Strategies, a conference business here in the U.S. They were hosting an event in Europe, their Global Cybersecurity Summit. It was quite interesting, a day and a half, probably had about 100 people there, mostly a mix of financial services people, some from Europe, some from the United States, and a lot of talk about how cybersecurity risks can manifest as clearly operational risks that people have to worry about. Some hacker sneaks in and turns off all the lights and all the plants in your operation. Also, though, some talk of how boards of directors are supposed to try to think about cybersecurity risk, how operational threats from cybersecurity might translate into bigger financial risks that others need to worry about. There were a fair number of attendees from the insurance industry who are theoretically going to backstop all of these financial losses from all of these attacks that may or may not happen. So really, it was a very good and worthwhile idea. Kudos to Skytop for putting it on, and we had a couple of good points that came up from there. If you want me to geek out on them a little bit, I'm more than happy to do it.
Sure, you bet.
So I thought one thing that came up a lot was the Internet of Things, which is that idea that as we put more Internet connectivity into our devices, what is that really going to mean for companies? We spent a fair bit of the conference talking about a hypothetical of the Internet-enabled washer-dryer unit. Apparently, these are now for sale, that you can go online and turn on your washer or dryer. Whoever would want to do this by the Internet, I don't know. I just did a load of laundry this afternoon myself. I do it the old-fashioned way. I go to the laundry room and turn it on. But, what would happen if somebody did come in and try and disrupt operations there? I think companies need to be aware that the legal framework for how you would parcel out liability for a big cyber attack is still unclear. Let's go back to the washer dryer example. You might wind up having some liability from the washer dryer maker, maybe from the chip that is internet enabled that the maker put into the washer dryer. What if I went and bought the chip at Best Buy myself and then I put it in, and so the washer dryer company didn't authorize this, but I did it? What about the wireless carrier that maybe security was breached there that let somebody hack its way in and then Suddenly I did 10 loads of laundry in a day and my electricity bill is through the roof. I guess that might be one way they could cyber attack me through my dryer. But nobody knows. And that's just one of the more humorous examples. But one of the scarier examples was what if we have kill switches in our cars in case they're reported stolen? Right. Which actually is that technology exists. It is in cars today. What if somebody hacked into the maker of those chips and that service and turned off all cars in the country for 24 hours because reported all of them as stolen? Think of the damage that would do. Think of the damage it would do to the company that provides that service, which would be liable. Think about the insurer who would be bailing out that company, who wouldn't have enough money for an attack of that scope. And then now the insurance company is maybe undercapitalized. Now think about the banks that loan to that insurer or have trades with that insurer. And now suddenly we're back to a financial crisis in 2008. We don't know which of our counterparties has money or not. Now, could an attack like that happen tomorrow? No. Could an attack like that happen in 2025? Possibly, because we don't really have any good answers right now on how would we parcel out that kind of problem? How would we solve it? We don't know. Right. And what are boards and companies trying to do to think about this? Now, they're thinking about it a lot, but as I like to say, boards like to panic about cybersecurity. They just don't know how to panic about it effectively. And we're still very much in that kind of mindset right now with these kind of risks. But it was a very informative sort of discussion.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
So, Matt, as always, a pleasure to visit with you. I love geeking out on this and certainly have given me a lot to think about. And I would just reiterate for any of our listeners, if you have a question you'd like us to go into the weeds on, please either email Matt or myself. I'm going to link to Matt's blog posts that I've referenced here so that you'll have that in the show notes. And Matt, thanks again and look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right, Tom, take care.